Welcome to your Chapter 15 Part 3 video. This is all on freshwater pollution, basically how we make freshwater dirty and how we clean it up. And in terms of cleanup, just remember the only times we're really interested in cleaning up freshwater is when we want to drink it. Alright, your first question says define the 6 categories of water pollution. Don't freak out, there's only 5. Those 5 are highlighted, I believe, in red in your book. They're the 5 categories there. Nutrient pollution, pathogen/waterborne disease pollution, toxic chemicals, sediment. I also included physical pollution in there. I'll explain what I'm talking about in a second. And then thermal pollution. There are a couple of other types of pollution that are not on here that we will discuss in the supplemental lecture. Alright, the first is nutrient pollution. We've talked about this about 80 bajillion times, so I'm only going to give this a tiny amount of time here. Eutrophication. Excess nutrients, nitrates and phosphates in either waste, usually animal waste or inorganic fertilizer, wash from golf courses, from feedlots, from farms, from homes, into lakes, or perhaps into a river and then into a lake due to runoff. The lake becomes hypertrophic. Hyper means too much. Trophic refers to life. So there's too much of these life-giving nutrients that are in there. So then you have, remember that the fertilizer does not kill fish. The fertilizer causes algae to grow. Algae goes nuts. Algae starts dying. Decomposing bacteria go nuts. And in order to do what they do, they suck all the oxygen out of the water. That makes it hypoxic. Hypo means less. So that then kills the fish. You also have an increase in sediment because the bacteria just can't keep up with all of the stuff dying. Here are some sources of eutrophication like I talked about. You really need to tuck some of these away in your brain. But here's what I'm talking about in terms of how eutrophication can not only affect the quality of the water, it also can make the lake completely dry up. It'll stack up in decades instead of centuries. Do also realize that nitrates are physically toxic to humans, but that's something we're going to talk about in a couple of units. So just keep that in the back of your head. It won't be on this unit exam. Alright, and here is a fish kill that took place in St. Petersburg because of the eutrophication cycle. Alright, pathogen pollution. A pathogen is a microscopic organism that causes disease. They come in, we'll call it 4 different varieties: bacterial, viral, protozoans, and then parasitic worms. On an exam, I would recommend that you tuck a bacteria, a virus, and a parasitic protozoa into the back of your head. If you have to just focus on 2, the bacteria and the virus. So for bacteria, I always like to go with cholera and typhoid fever. I believe those are mentioned in your book. Virus, Hep B, hepatitis B is in there, and giardiasis, I can't even say it, I'm sorry, it's the one that starts with a G. Protozoa does that as well. Remember, a protozoa is a single-celled organism. Much like what causes malaria. Now you're going to notice diarrhea is heavily featured here, and as funny as that is, for some of you, it should not be, because things like diarrhea and vomiting cause you to become not only depleted of fluids but also depleted of electrolytes, and it can kill you within a couple of days. Remember, when you're talking about a third world country, you cannot just run out to Walmart or Target to get some Gatorade. It's a killer. It is absolutely a killer. Things like cholera can be easily survived if you can stay hydrated through the diarrhea and vomiting periods. So if you get hydration, you're fine. If you don't, you die. And you see mostly these diseases are killers of children under the age of 5. So not super funny. This again comes from drinking untreated water that has these pathogens in it. Usually they're either shed from human waste or they're in animal waste. In the supplemental lecture, we are going to discuss what water quality is like in other countries, especially third world countries. And those diseases are typical of third world countries. All right, toxic chemical pollutants. Let's see. I'm going to get this out of the book. Is anything poisonous at low doses? Please remember that the dose makes the poison. Water can be toxic if you drink enough of it over a short enough period of time. So when we talk about toxic chemicals, we're talking about things that are bad for human health at low doses. All right, so it includes things like arsenic, which occurs in places like Bangladesh in their normal water supply, and it's something that's really tough to get out of the water. Why do they drink it, you may ask? They don't have any other sources of water. Mercury, lead, hexanes, oil, etc., etc., etc. So any of that stuff can be in there. Now, these aren't necessarily toxic, but pharmaceuticals, anything you ingest in your body, you're going to urinate out at least a small amount of it. So everything from antidepressants to birth control to antibiotics, trace amounts of it do get into our water, and although it doesn't necessarily kill you, it can alter your health, which is what makes it toxic, and these water treatment plants can't hit these. Plus also, people who flush their excess meds down the toilet, they end up in your drinking water. Alright, why are toxic chemicals and heavy metals such a problem? They don't break down, and heavy metals are often stored in fatty tissues to stay in the body indefinitely. The fattiest area is the brain. We did the biomagnification demo in class. I'll do it one more time to show you how even low levels of these non-degradable toxins can end up being in doses that are problematic later on. And then again, specific diseases are going to be addressed in later units that are associated with toxic chemicals. All right, I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but just do realize that arsenic, which is AS, that is its symbol in the periodic table, you mostly find arsenic in drinking water in places like Bangladesh, West Bengal, northern Chile. There's also some in the western half of the United States, but because we are a developed country, it is easy to go ahead and simply avoid that water source and get your water from somewhere else. Human health hazards is everything from discolored skin to cancer. There are places that are working on purification systems to remove arsenic, but of course, inevitably, they are expensive and beyond the reach of the very places that need them. All right, your book only talks about sediment, which is if you have no vegetation in the ground, when it rains, dirt runs off with the water, goes into your drinking supply. And the sediment can contain disease, but also it's dirt. Nobody wants dirt in their water. This is also a result of clear-cutting forests. You don't know what that means yet. That's coming in a later unit. Mining is a problem, later unit. And just some sources of water are just muddy. That's just the way that they're made. And do realize that some freshwater ecosystems, animals need the cover of the cloudy water in order to survive. The reason I call this physical pollutants instead of sediment is, don't forget, dumping of garbage into your water supply is also a problem. Anything you flush down the toilet has to be screened out at wastewater treatment plants before it's put back into inevitably what our drinking supply is, because otherwise it will end up in your drinking water. All right, here's sediment pollution. Here, again, third world countries, you just dump your trash into a river because it goes away. Well, we know there's no way, but, this is... Up until the 1970s, we did exactly the same thing here in this country, until we had laws that penalized people for doing this kind of thing. Here is a highly polluted river in China, and... Here is a very convenient way of getting rid of garbage. You dump it into a river. All right, I know we talk about a lot of depressing stuff in this class. Do realize that citizen unrest at things that they don't like, you get changes. So it used to be that Lake Washington was used as a sewage dump by 10 sewage treatment plants. So they would take sewage and they would separate the clean water, and then they would take the junk and then they would just dump it in the Lake Washington. And you can see that by 1955 they had a huge eutrophication problem. And then All right, so public pressure led to cleanup of the lake. And, now by 1976, it was exactly the way it was before these problems started. Now, the reason the slide is here is this is just kind of slightly interesting in that we saw reverse evolution go on when the lake was clear. When the lake was extremely cloudy, you can see that the fish, sticklebacks that were in the lake, which you can see is right outside of Seattle, didn't need any armor because nothing could see them. And they were small, they didn't need a lot of musculature to get away, they just kind of hang out in the murky water. As the water cleared, you could see that selective forces drove evolution or natural selection towards the physiology of being larger, more muscular, and with more armor plating on them. So, modern example of evolution, this could only have happened because there were variations in the population. And that allowed it to survive because it pushed it into, it was directional forces that forced it to go into one physiology as opposed to the other. All right, thermal pollution. We don't think of heat as being a pollutant, but if you've ever gotten a fish and you've brought it home, they always tell you, keep it in the bag, put the bag into the tank, and let the water temperatures equalize before you let the fish out. And it's because fish are very sensitive to thermal shock. So, water is sometimes needed to cool processes, and it's sucked out of the river, and then it's injected right back into the river when it's warm or sometimes hot, and it will kill the fish that's there. Please also realize, and this is in your book, something that's important, warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen than cooler water. So that also means even the fish that survive the thermal shock, they have less oxygen to breathe in the water. Right, and here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is a power plant that is using the water to cool down its processes. Now here is a pro. As you guys know, here in Lee County, we have a manatee park, and it's because the manatees every winter cluster around a warm water discharge pipe from the power plant. So it is turned into a haven for these endangered animals. So as with everything, there's cons, but there's also pros. All right, oh, that's annoying. Let's see if I've covered everything. Let's see. Your book also mentions for thermal pollution that warmer water encourages the growth of pathogens that harm both animals and us. Don't forget also thermal pollution is also a byproduct of reverse osmosis and distillation plants. Warmer water may also support the establishment of invasive species, stuff like trout that like cold water versus suckermouth catfish that like the warmer water. All right, differentiate between point and non-point sources. Think about the word point. Point sources are you can point at something and go, there's the idiot that's doing the pollution. It's a very obvious who or what is putting pollution into the water. Enforcing cleanup, though, is still sometimes difficult. The fault and legal responsibility are sometimes two totally different things. All right, non-point sources are basically where you have a bunch of different, you can't tell, lots of little sources of pollution that individually are not a problem, but when they come together cause the issue, but you cannot point at one person and go, hey, it's your leaky car that tipped the balance and made it so this water is now officially quote-unquote polluted. And this is where public awareness campaigns are a big help. So if you're on national exams, if you are ever asked, how can we reduce X pollution? One great answer is always public awareness campaign. Or pay people to do the right thing or penalize them if they don't. Change your oil. Turn it into these places and we'll give you $1 off coupon for buying your next batch of oil rather than dumping it down the drains in your neighborhood, as an example. All right, point source of pollution. Pointing right at it, oh look, that's where the pollution is coming from. This is a non-point source of sediment. You've got all these farms around here and they've all contributed to this, but you can see, which is the one that's kind of pushed this over into the limit of quote-unquote bad water. Here's some other examples of point and non-point solution. If I'm going too fast, remember this is your video and you can stop at any time. Here's another list. I suggest that you look at this and commit at least one of them to memory. All right, water analysis. List biological, chemical, and physical properties of water that scientists use to determine overall water quality. All right, we did this during the water quality analysis lab that we did, the water quality index of the pond in the back of our school. So, the biological tests, all of them that you could do are fecal coliform, algae counts, invertebrate biodiversity, and then this is not in your book. I'll talk about it again during the supplemental lecture, but the presence of nitrate and phosphate loving plants like cattails are a great indicator species of elevated levels of nitrates and phosphates. So let's see what I've got in my notes for you. All right, fecal coliform, you have waste present that may contain disease. If you have an algae count, too much algae can mean that you have high nitrate and phosphate levels. Invertebrate biodiversity, if you have a high biodiversity of invertebrates, I'll show you a picture in a second, that's good. All right, chemical tests include things like pH. Slightly acidic pH is ideal. Odor, is the water stinky? Hardness. Hardness means you have calcium and magnesium ions present. Nitrate and phosphate levels, remember we measure those in parts per million, which is ppm, which is the same thing as mg/L, which is milligrams per liter. Commit those to memory. And then also dissolved oxygen levels. And the shorthand for dissolved oxygen is DO. Biological oxygen demand kind of straddles both, because remember that's where you take a sample of the water, you put it in something completely dark like aluminum foil, and then you stick it in a drawer for 5 days at a constant temperature, because you're preventing photosynthesis from occurring, but you're allowing whatever little critters that are in there to go ahead and use the oxygen, and then you measure what's left, and usually if you have no oxygen left, that tells you you've got a ton of bacteria in there, and that is an issue. Remember, low dissolved oxygen levels means that it can't support life. High nitrate and phosphate levels means you could be setting yourself up for an algal bloom. And then with hardness, too much is a problem. Physical tests are turbidity, which is how cloudy is the water. You can either use a test I'm going to show you in class, or something called a Secchi disc. Again, I'm going to show you that in class during the supplemental lecture. That's just you kind of eyeball when a disc looks like it's disappearing when you lower it into the water. Suspended solids is where you take water and you evaporate all the water from it, and then you measure how much matter is left, and you use a graph, and that tells you, it gives you a value for the water quality for that particular element. The temperature of the water, and remember, because the colder it is, the more oxygen can hold. And then flat out color. Please realize that different ecosystems have different levels that, like one ecosystem, turbidity and a brown color to the water could be vital to that ecosystem. Here in the state of Florida, if you look when you're going down a river, it looks like you're canoeing in tea, or you're kayaking in tea. That's just because our plants are high in tannins, and those leak into the water. It doesn't mean the water quality is bad. That's just kind of the way it is. So please realize that although we can give a general number to water quality, you really need to know your ecosystem to know if something is quote-unquote good or bad. All right. Again, we talked about this. This may be interesting for you. You count the number of colonies. I'm going to show you what I'm talking about here in a second. So you take the water, you put it onto a plate full of nutrients, and you wait for stuff to grow, and then you count the number of dots that you have. All right, so when you do that, each dot is called a colony of bacteria. If you want to drink the water, you should have no colonies on there. So this is a test that water treatment plants do on the regular. If you want to swim in it, no more than 200 colonies. Sorry guys, there's going to be some coliform bacteria in the water that you swim in, even in public pools. And then raw sewage has several million colonies in it per unit. Okay, here on the left is a traditional plate. Here on the right is a test that you could run. This is called a broth tube, and the color changes because of a chemical reaction that takes place when the bacteria eat all the stuff that's in here and then excrete their waste. It turns it yellow. So that's a chemical reaction that takes place. I will tell you this right now, I didn't bother to do this for our pond in the back because that broth tube would turn yellow, which basically means too many colonies to count in a heartbeat. Invertebrate biology, you usually see this done in rivers. This is called a kick net. Again, this is not going to be on your unit exam necessarily, but it's something to know. You hold hold a net across a river, kind of kick stuff out of the bottom of the river into the net, and you count the little critters, and the more that you have, the more different kinds you have, the healthier the river is. So these are indicator species of the health of the river. You guys remember this from what we did, pH, nitrate, and phosphate tests. You basically perform a chemical reaction, and the color that you're given allows you to kind of estimate the concentrations of what is in your water sample. All right, when it comes to what is good and terrible for dissolved oxygen levels, you can see that there is a very small sweet spot. Really, you need to have between, let's say, 7 and 9 parts per million excuse me, of dissolved oxygen in order to have a healthy freshwater body. And that also means low levels of bacteria. So you don't have a lot of leeway here. All right, turbidity, this is just kind of showing you what I'm talking about. Turbidity is just really cloudy, how much of the solids are suspended in the water. All right, this is not in your book, but just remember that you can test upwards of 9 components, and they all have different measurements, so to normalize them to each other so you can actually work with the numbers, you assign each a Q value based on a graph that you have. Dissolved oxygen is the only one that requires that you also know the temperature of your sample. Then you weight them according to importance, and you add them up to get an overall water quality index number. I will tell you right now, there will be a few questions on your exam that come from the lab. So just, you don't have to memorize the graphs, just realize how this works. Here are the weighted factors in order of importance. I would know that dissolved oxygen and fecal coliforms are the 2 most important ones. Least important is probably total solids, so just kind of get a sense of where things rank. And water quality, kind of know if I give you a number, is that really great or is it really terrible water quality? So I'm going to be interested to see what your numbers are when we come back from break. All right, the next question on your list, I'm trying to go as fast as I can, I promise. Explain why pollutants in groundwater can be more problematic than pollutants in surface water. Because it can contaminate an entire aquifer, making it very difficult to clean up. Aquifers are often sources of drinking water, so it can make people sick or kill them. So you get a little bit into a groundwater area. That water doesn't move sometimes for millions of years. And plus it's tough to get down there. Prevention is always cheaper than cleanup. And here's a picture kind of showing you how all the pollution can get in there. All right, list chemicals that are toxic at high levels in groundwater. List sources for these pollutants. Naturally occurring pollutants are things like arsenic, aluminum, fluoride. Before you freak out about that, it has to be at extremely high levels. The fluoride that you get at the dentist and that's in your drinking water is very low levels. And I can tell you that places in Canada where they've taken fluoride out of the water, their childhood incidence of cavities has skyrocketed. We also see that here in the United States in families where they give the kids exclusively bottled water. Fluoride in your water is a good thing, but at low levels. Nitrates can occur naturally, as can sulfates. All of these things at high enough levels can impact your health. Improperly designed wells, that's the oil wells, and then also drinking water wells, hazardous waste. There are things that are called VOCs, volatile organic compounds. I won't necessarily test you on this. You're going to hear it more during the fossil fuel unit. Those include things like chloroform and hexane. A volatile organic compound is anything that if I put a bucket of it in the corner of a room, you could smell it immediately upon coming to the room. Volatile means that it turns into a gas very easily. These things are also usually flammable, so you can understand why they're a problem even if you don't ingest them. All right, tanks that leak. Everything from sewage to hazardous waste to fossil fuels. That can end up in your water. And then agricultural runoff of waste and fertilizer. That says nitrates and phosphates, but also remember if you're talking about waste, you can also have disease-bearing microorganisms in there. All right. Know the U.S. laws associated with U.S. freshwater quality. Dude, these are listed word for word at the end of your unit packet. Please know the difference between the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. Clean Water Act is the water that you play in. Hey, we got to make sure that it's not polluted. Safe Drinking Water Act is, hey, the water that you drink that comes out of your tap should not make you sick. These were not laws until the mid-70s. Before that, your water could kill you. And it was not illegal to literally dump toxic waste into water supplies. Okay, CERCLA is a cleanup act. Dude, you screwed up. First of all, that place is hazardous. And now, hey, you need to go ahead and clean it up. The problem, of course, is that this act was defunded in the early 2000s, I believe. Here, let me check my notes. Yeah, the fund went bankrupt in 2004. So we have the ability usually to say, hey, that's a hazardous waste site, don't go there. But we don't have any money left to clean it up or prosecute the people who caused the problem in the first place. Oh, also, not that you need to know this for the test, but do realize that there are 80 separate qualities that the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, mandates must be at certain levels in your drinking water. So the stuff that comes out of your tap is actually more regulated than the stuff that goes into bottles, something we're going to talk about in class. And then the U.S. Water Quality Act, I messed up. This is not in your book. I will talk about it during the supplemental lecture. All right. Yes, and I do expect for you to know these for your reading quiz. All right, this Cuyahoga River in Ohio, it was so loaded with flammable pollutants it would catch fire regularly. It did at least a dozen times in the 50s and the 60s. After water quality laws were installed in the 1970s, you can see that the river is now clean enough to fish from. There are also some successes in the Great Lakes. Phosphorus chlorinated pollutants, PCBs, which are a plastic additive, and DDEs, which is similar, those levels were reduced. However, they still have a problem there with everything from sediment to mercury. So we're starting to see some cleanup successes in the Great Lakes, but we still have some things to work on there. But again, please realize that the way things are right now is not the way that they have to be. A little bit of citizen activism, a little bit of follow through, and you can have things the way that they should be. All right. Describe how arsenic ended up in the drinking water of Bangladesh. It's naturally occurring arsenic salt deposits near aquifers. What are the consequences of arsenic poisoning? Skin lesions on the palms of hands and the soles of the feet are the first indication that you have been poisoned, and you end up dying of cancer. Either lung cancer, bladder cancer, or kidney and liver cancer. You also see skin cancer as well. If you happen to Google this, you'll notice, that's why I didn't put anything on here. I'll leave that to you guys. All right, and here's how this works. I don't know if you can see this, but there are arsenic salts under here. The aquifers naturally run over them and pick up the water, and you can see that in Bangladesh, you don't have water in your homes. You go to a central village, and you pump that stuff out and take it home. All right. How is water treated before it comes out of the tap? You treat it with chemicals to remove particulate matter. Particulate matter is physical. Or you put something called alum in there, which causes flocks, which are sticky globs. So you treat it with chemicals to basically force the physical sediment to clump together so that you can settle it out. Then you send it through filters of sand, gravel, and charcoal. And then you disinfect it with small amounts of stuff like chlorine. This is why they tell you to keep bleach in your house, because you can add a small cap full of it. It has a lot of chlorine in it to water so that you can end up drinking and bathing with it in times of emergency. And then you add things like fluoride to it and then it comes out your pipe. All right, there are other ways to purify drinking water. Here in the lower left-hand corner, this is called a nanotube. Good news is it allows you to drink out of water like this. By the time it hits your lips, it's like 97% pure. Bad news is, despite who's drinking out of it, these things are freaking expensive and they become useless after just a few uses. They're more of a survival tool for first world folks than they are as a third world solution. You can see here you can set up your own little filtration system using sand and gravel and activated charcoal. You actually do this in your aquariums. And here, if you simply put water in plastic bottles on a reflective surface, you kill virtually all of the bacteria in there over the course of a day. The downside is you do end up with some of the plastic additives in your water, and we'll discuss those effects a little bit later on, but you know, sometimes you have to make these choices. All right. Explain the expense involved in treating contaminated water. It's way more expensive by millions to clean up than it is to prevent. What is wastewater? Water that is used by people in some way. So, how do we deal with wastewater? Here's the usual scenario in the United States. It goes down the drain, series of sewage pipes, goes to a wastewater treatment plant, and then out into its natural source. So here's what I want you to think. We do all of this stuff, and when it goes out into the natural source, it's essentially drinkable. Then, what do we do in order to have drinking water? We then pull out that same water and treat it again, and it comes out of your tap. Here's the problem. Nobody wants to drink water that has come directly from a wastewater treatment plant. I know that the plant in Tampa tried this when the bottled water craze started. Nobody bought their bottled water, even though it was perfectly drinkable, and I'm going to show you some videos in class about that. So it's a stigma. When you think about that, every single sip of water that you have was peed out of an organism at some point during its trip through the water cycle. With all of the water shortages that are going on, this is probably something that we really need to get over. Some homes have on-site septic tanks. If you're in a third world country, you do not have wastewater treatment plants. You simply pull water out of a source and hope it's clean. If you have enough knowledge, you can try and boil it and filter it a little bit, but that doesn't always happen. Alright, so here's how a septic tank system works. In areas where municipal, remember municipal means community. Also, by the way, potable means drinkable, so keep that in mind. In areas where municipal wastewater treatment is not available, home waste is collected in an underground tank near the house. You can see it right here. Solids and oils separate from the water. This clarified wastewater goes out into a drainage field. So if somebody has a septic tank system, please do not go play on the slightly mounded greenest part of their backyard, because that's where the wastewater comes out. So it comes out through perforated pipes in the surrounding downhill area, and you can see it's surrounded by gravel. Microbes decompose anything in the wastewater that's there, and then the solids and oils are collected and taken to a landfill regularly by a company hired to do this. Please realize that this stuff eventually goes into a landfill, and when we talk about solid waste, you're going to see why this is one of those things people don't think about. Alright, so sewage treatment, wastewater treatment plants, 3 stages: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary is a physical separation. You get all of the physical bits out, and so that's everything from picture of the ex-boyfriend that got flushed down the toilet, or Matchbox cars, or anything else that you can think of that got flushed down the toilet. So that's the physical part. The secondary treatment is where you encourage the naturally occurring bacteria to grow and do their thing. You aerate the mix, you warm it up, you stir it, you love on it, and you go, bacteria, eat everything that's in there. So they do. And you have most of the clarification that takes place. During secondary treatment, you may also have a secondary clarifier, so then you have anything else that needs to settle out gets settled out. And then tertiary treatment, it's like, bacteria, thank you for your service, now you're going to die. So you put chlorine in there, you filter it through coal and sand, you hit it with UV light, sometimes you hit it with ozone, and you kill it. Most of the time you can drink it at this point, but we don't. It goes back out into the natural water sources, where we pull it out again and put it through an entirely other separate treatment system. Okay, what pollutants do you think will remain after the treatment? Chemicals like nitrates and phosphates aren't always caught, medicines, and other chemical contaminants. So those are things that wastewater treatment plants are dealing with all of the time. How does this wastewater treatment plant compare with septic systems? It treats on a much larger scale. Some of these plants are square miles in terms of their size, and it makes the water drinkable. Again, compare and contrast this to this. Oh, also, where it says Grit disposal and sludge treatment and disposal. All this physical stuff that comes out's got to go somewhere, which is a landfill. All right, so again, we talked about this. You may want to pause this and read the slide, but what is effluent? It's treated water released into the ocean or river. Reclaimed water is partially or fully treated water used for irrigation or industrial purposes as opposed to drinking. This is just an FYI for you. What happens during storms like hurricanes and big rainstorms? Sewage is often released early in treatment, so it means maybe after primary or a little bit of secondary in here. So and that because that keeps the wastewater treatment plants from flooding. So the takeaway is, please don't play in storm runoff because it could have partially treated sewage in it. All right. Describe how nature can be used to treat wastewater. It's called the living machine. You use plants and animals to cleanse the water. What are some advantages? It's a natural process that works. It can provide crops to sell, like the shrimp that do the cleansing, provided that the water is not chemically contaminated, like with something like mercury. They're very cheap to build and maintain, provides area where biodiversity can accumulate. You can do these in small areas, like there is one at a nearby nature center that they use to clean their toilet water because they're too far away from any sort of piped water out there. It's small. It's about the size of a place where you would be one, maybe two pools in your backyard, or it can be as big as a marsh. Now, disadvantages is the bigger ones take up space, they're slow, and it may not catch heavy metals before they influence the local wildlife. Now, plants can absorb the contaminants, but you have to then regularly harvest them and take those to a secure landfill. Here's the one at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Like I said, it passes it through plants and animals, and it's amazing. It takes care of the waste naturally. Here's another living machine. And here is an artificial wetland created for wastewater treatment. By the time it goes through its entire cycle here, it comes out almost ready to drink. You just usually have to hit it with UV. Or you can do something called a floating wetland. This is a science fair project from one of my kids from a couple years ago, where you just set plants out and you just let them sit and they will naturally cleanse the water. All right, and that is the end of our kind of lengthy Chapter 15, Part 3, but I have every confidence you will do just fine on this quiz.